On a storm-stained night, a father dragged his daughter into the saloon, ready to sell her soul for a handful of coins. The town lay under a restless wind that carried dust down its one crooked street. The lanterns along the boardwalk burned weakly against the night, their yellow glow fractured by glass streaked with grime. The saloon doors creaked and groaned as if tired of the men who pushed through them each evening, men with tobacco on their breath and weariness in their eyes. It was a place where laughter sounded more like coughing, where coins were counted with the same hands that knew the weight of pistols. That night, the doors banged open harder than usual. A man stumbled through, weaving like a ship in storm waters, his boots dragging mud across the floorboards. He smelled of whiskey before he even spoke, a heavy stench that made nearby patrons wrinkle their noses. His hair was wild, his shirt torn at the collar, but worse than the man himself was what he pulled behind him. A girl. She was young, no more than 19, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders as though the thin cloth could shield her from the stares that met her. A long braid trailed over her chest, strands already loosened, trembling like a fragile rope in the wind. She did not look up. Her chin was low, her eyes fixed on the warped planks beneath her feet, as if she believed if she did not see the men, perhaps they would not see her. But they did. The room turned toward her with a slow hunger. Chairs scraped. Dice paused mid-roll. A cough stuttered into silence. And then came the sound that made her grip her shawl tighter, the jeering laughter of men who had seen too much sorrow to call anything sacred. The drunken father dragged her forward until he reached the bar. His words came in slurred spits, his tongue heavy but his purpose plain enough. He spoke of debts, of owing too much and having too little, of a daughter who was young, strong, and still untouched by labor or time. His hand pressed against her shoulder as though she were nothing more than a sack of grain he had brought for trade. The bartender did not reply. He only wiped the counter with his rag, eyes lowering in shame he would never voice. But another man at the bar leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as if appraising livestock. He was older, his beard long, his belly heavy, his belt buckle wide and polished. His hand dipped into his coat and came back with silver coins. They clinked against the counter, bright in the dim lamplight. The sound was sharp enough to echo, as if the coins themselves were eager to be spent. The girl did not flinch, though her fingers twisted hard into her shawl until the fabric strained. Her lips parted, but no sound came, not even a prayer. The father nodded at the coins swaying on his feet, a grin spreading across his cracked lips. He looked back at his daughter with bleary triumph as though he had just proven his worth. But the girl's eyes remained fixed on the floor. To look up, to see the face of the man who would claim her, would be to surrender, and she clung desperately to the silence she still controlled. Outside, thunder grumbled. A slow rolling sound that carried over the plains and into the bones of the town. A few drops of rain struck the windows, streaking through the dust that had clung there for weeks. Soon rivulets began to run, carrying with them the grit, the ash, the remnants of other storms. Inside the saloon, the men continued to watch. Some with pity they buried under their drinks, others with the dull apathy of men who had seen too many trades like this to care. One or two with the gleam of envy that the old rancher had coins enough to purchase what they could not. The girl felt each gaze like a brand against her skin. She knew in that dim and bitter-smelling room that her father was lost beyond saving. His soul had already been sold to the bottle long before he tried to sell hers for silver. And she knew with a hollow certainty that nothing she said would stop him. She was voiceless here, a shadow in a room of men, a possession whose fate was measured not in prayers or dreams but in coins that could be stacked on a counter. She shifted, drawing her braid over her shoulder as if it could shield her heart. But even that simple gesture felt like a rebellion, the only defiance she had left. The storm outside thickened, the rain hitting harder against the saloon roof, the sound like fingers drumming in warning. For the first time that night, one or two men glanced away from the girl, their attention drawn to the weather as if sensing change riding with it. But she did not see the storm. She did not feel the rain. She only felt the weight of her father's hand pressing her forward and the hunger in the old rancher's eyes. And she realized, in that moment, that her father was gone. Not gone in death, but gone in a way worse than burial. Gone to shame, to weakness, to a greed so low it no longer resembled love. He was a hollow man, and she was the only coin he had left to spend. The lamplight flickered, shadows stretching long across the warped walls. Somewhere in the darkness, change was waiting, though she could not yet see it. She lowered her head again, a silent figure in a world of noise, waiting for whatever came next. At the far edge of the saloon, where lamplight grew dim and smoke curled like restless ghosts, a man stood apart from the others. His back leaned against a wooden post worn smooth by years of shoulders pressing into it. His hat brim hung low, shadowing his face, but not enough to hide the scar that cut a pale line across his cheek. An old wound, earned in silence and never spoken of. His coat was plain, his boots dust-caked, but the rifle slung across his shoulder bore the wear of long use, its stock polished by hands that had carried it for decades. His name was Elias. Most in town knew him by sight, though few knew him in truth. A rancher who lived miles beyond the far ridges, where the prairie met the mountains and the snow stayed longer than it should. He came into town only when supplies forced him, and even then he spoke little, choosing to pass through like a shadow that neither asked for notice nor gave any. Yet tonight his eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding. He had watched the drunken man stagger in, had watched the girl dragged behind him like a calf to market. He had watched the coins fall bright against the counter, their ring louder to him than any gunshot. Something inside him stirred, not rage. Elias had lived too long to spend his anger carelessly. It was something quieter, heavier, memory. He saw not the girl but a ghost of another. His sister, long gone, her braid cut short, her eyes just as downcast, her silence just as sharp. He remembered the night she vanished, the night he had failed to follow her, the promise he had broken when he swore he would protect her. And so when the older rancher reached out to claim the girl, Elias moved. The floorboards groaned under his step. Chairs shifted as men glanced toward him, surprise breaking across faces that had grown used to his distance. His voice when it came was not loud, yet it carried clear, steady, as unyielding as iron. "She goes with me." For a heartbeat, silence pressed against the saloon walls. Then Elias dropped coins onto the counter. Not the greedy clink of purchase, but the sharp weight of refusal. Silver scattered and spun before settling in defiance, not as a trade for flesh, but as a command for the father to walk away. The drunken man blinked, swaying, his grin faltering. His lips curled into curses, spit flying from his mouth. "She's mine to give," he slurred, his voice thick with whiskey. But the steadiness in Elias's gaze was a thing he could not challenge. It was not threat that held him, but a certainty deeper than threat, the certainty of a man who had decided something unchangeable. The father's curses dwindled into muttering. His shoulders sagged, his steps faltered, and at last he stumbled back, scooping the coins with greedy, fumbling fingers before staggering toward the door. His shadow wavered in the lamplight, then vanished into the rain outside. The old rancher at the bar growled under his breath but did not move. He had seen the set of Elias's hand near the rifle, and he was too old to gamble his life for what silver had failed to buy. The girl stood still, shawl clutched close, her braid trembling against her chest. Slowly, cautiously, her eyes lifted, not all the way, not enough to meet his, but enough to glance at the man who had spoken for her. The look in her eyes was not relief. It was suspicion, confusion, a question she did not dare form. Had she been rescued or simply traded from one master to another? Elias did not reach for her. He only turned, walked to the door, and stepped into the rain. Outside, the night smelled of wet earth and horses. The street was empty but for lanterns swaying in the storm wind, their light spilling across mud already pooling into puddles. He paused, then turned back, his hand steady as he extended it toward her. The rain pattered on his hat brim, dripping from its edge. He did not speak. The offer was silent, a bridge built from patience rather than command. The girl stood in the doorway, the saloon's lamplight behind her, the storm before her. For a moment she seemed caught between two worlds, the cage she knew and the one she could not yet trust. Her braid slipped over her shoulder like a shadow sliding forward, her fingers tightening around it as though it were the last piece of herself she could cling to. She hesitated. The rain fell harder. The mud smelled of iron and earth. The coins behind her were already forgotten. The men inside returned to their cards, their laughter forced, pretending they had not witnessed something heavier than they wished to carry home. At last, the girl stepped down onto the boardwalk. She did not take his hand, not yet. She walked past it, her shawl drawn tight, her face hidden, but she walked into the storm beside him. Elias lowered his hand, saying nothing. He only fell into step with her, the sound of their boots lost in the hiss of rain. The street stretched wide and dark before them, a path unchosen, but already begun. The rain did not last through the night. By the time Elias led the girl to where his horse waited, the storm had broken into scattered drops and the sky was already paling toward dawn. Clouds stretched long and low, tinged faintly with rose and gray, the kind of morning light that made the earth smell raw and clean. The horse stamped its hooves impatiently in the mud, snorting steam into the cool air. Elias lifted the saddlebag, checking the straps before turning to the girl. She stood still, shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her braid hanging damp against her chest. She looked neither at him nor at the horse. Her eyes stayed lowered, as if the horizon itself might betray her if she dared to meet it. He spoke quietly. "It's a long ride," no answer. Only the sound of water dripping from the eaves of a nearby stable. Without pressing her, Elias mounted, then reached down a steady hand. For a breath she hesitated. Then, with a small, reluctant movement, she placed her palm against his. He drew her up behind him. The horse shifted under their combined weight, and together they set out, hooves thudding against the damp earth. The town fell away quickly, swallowed by distance and morning mist. Ahead stretched the open plains, endless in their silence. Wet sage perfumed the air, mingling with the sharp, fresh scent of soil turned by rain. A hawk wheeled above them, its cry cutting through the stillness. The girl clutched her shawl tightly, holding herself apart, though pressed close by necessity. She said nothing. Elias did not force words from her. Instead, he pointed with a gloved hand toward the horizon. "See the buttes there? They catch fire at sunset, red as iron fresh from the forge." She did not respond, but her gaze flickered, just once, toward where he gestured. A little farther on, he reined in, lowering his voice. "Antelope," he said. In the distance, lean shapes bounded across the wet grass, their white tails flashing. For a moment her grip loosened, her fingers less rigid against the saddle. Still no words. The trail stretched long, hours slipping by in the measured rhythm of hooves. The land shifted from soaked grass to stretches of hard earth, where wagon tracks carved pale scars. Windmills turned slowly against the wind, creaking, their blades glinting faintly in the dawn light. Elias spoke once or twice more, pointing out a coyote track in the mud, a stand of cottonwoods by the creek. His words were not meant to be answered, only to remind her that the world held more than the memory of men's cruelty. By the time the sun broke fully over the horizon, Elias's homestead came into view. A small, weathered house stood against the open sky, its wood darkened by age, its porch uneven but standing firm. A rocking chair moved slightly in the wind, creaking as if it remembered the weight of someone long gone. Beside the barn, old tools leaned against the wall, a broken plow, a rusted saw, the relics of years when work had been harder and hands more numerous. Beyond the ranch, the mountains rose sharp and white, their snow lingering even as the plains thawed. The girl's eyes lingered on the house, then the barn, then the mountains. She did not speak, but her silence had shifted. It was no longer the silence of fear, but of watchfulness, as if she were measuring the edges of this new place. Elias dismounted, then held out his hand again. This time she did not hesitate, though she did not meet his eyes. Together they stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned under their weight, and the rocking chair swayed as though stirred by their arrival. Inside, the cabin was plain but steady. The hearth still held warmth from the fire Elias had banked before leaving. The scent of wood smoke hung in the air, mingled with the faint bitterness of old coffee grounds. A rifle rested above the hearth, its barrel polished but its wood worn from years of grip. On one wall hung a few photographs, their edges curling, the faces within them faded, a woman, a boy, a family whose names were no longer spoken aloud. Elias set about simple tasks without comment. He lit the fire, set water to boil, pulled bread from a tin and sliced it thick. The girl sat at the table, her shawl still drawn close, her eyes wandering the cabin's walls as though searching for something hidden within them. She paused longest on the photographs, her brow faintly furrowed, then on the rifle above the hearth, her gaze wary but steady. When Elias poured coffee into 2 tin cups, she accepted hers silently. She sipped slowly, the bitterness making her blink, but she drank. When he set bread before her, she ate in small measured bites as if each piece had to be tested first. Elias did not speak, and neither did she. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the wind brushing against the cabin walls, the faint creak of the rocking chair outside. Yet beneath that silence, something fragile stirred. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. The girl's eyes returned to the photographs, to the rifle, to the firelight that flickered across the cabin walls. She did not feel safe. Not entirely. But she was no longer in the saloon, no longer standing beneath the jeers of men, no longer pressed forward by her father's hand. She had been carried away from all that, though she did not yet know where she had been set down. For now, it was enough to sit by firelight, to taste bread and bitter coffee, to let the silence hold her without harm. It was not freedom, but it was not chains. And somewhere between those two truths, the first seed of safety began to take root. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, marked not by the world's demands but by the small acts that stitched two lives together. Clara began with simple chores, sweeping the dust from the floorboards, setting water to boil, mending a shirt whose seams had frayed with time. Each task she performed cautiously, as though measuring the edges of her place in this home. Names passed between them like tokens of trust. He was Elias, the rancher whose solitude clung to him like a second skin. She was Clara, speaking her name softly, almost as though she had to remind herself it still belonged to her. Yet the silence that followed their words held more than peace. It held shadows. At night, Elias sometimes heard her muffled sobs drifting through the cabin walls, breaking against his own sleeplessness. At dawn, he noticed her braid, wound so tightly it seemed like the single thread keeping her from unraveling. He bore his own weight, too. The rocking chair groaned beneath him as he stared into the fire, flames shaping themselves into the memory of his sister, whose grave lay far away, a wound that never closed. One evening, thunder rumbled low across the plains and Clara stepped outside. Rain fell heavy, soaking her dress, loosening her hair until the braid came undone. She did not flinch from it. She let the storm wash her clean. When she turned back, her voice emerged in fragments of her mother's absence, her father's debts, the night she was dragged into the saloon. Her words trembled, but they did not break. And Elias, listening, understood. She was not merely rescued. She was surviving. Night had settled deep across the plains when the sound came, hoofbeats hard and urgent, tearing through the quiet like a warning carried on the wind. Elias rose from his chair, the lantern throwing long shadows across the walls. He knew before he stepped outside who it was. Some debts refused to die. On the porch, rifle in hand, Elias faced them. The drunken father swayed in the saddle, flanked by two hard-eyed men whose laughter carried the edge of violence. "She's mine," the father slurred, voice thick with drink and rage. "You stole what I had to sell." The lantern light flickered across Elias's scarred cheek, across the rifle held steady in his hands. Behind him, inside the cabin, Clara pressed her back to the wall. Her braid clutched so tightly in her fingers it seemed she feared the world might pull her apart without it. The men jeered, spitting curses into the night, daring Elias to move. He did not flinch. Then the gunfire cracked, splitting the stillness. Smoke rose. Wood splintered from the cabin's frame, and the acrid smell of powder hung in the air. One man fell wounded to the ground, another turned and fled. The drunken father staggered into the dark, swallowed by the plains. When silence returned, Elias lowered his rifle, his chest rising heavy with breath. Clara stepped out onto the porch, shawl drawn close. She laid a trembling hand upon his arm. Her eyes met his, no longer bound by fear, but lit with the quiet certainty of someone who knew she would never again be bought or sold. Winter descended slowly, blanketing the plains in silence. Snow drifted against the cabin walls, softening the edges of the world, while the wind moaned through the cottonwoods like an old hymn. Inside, warmth held steady. The rifles above the hearth gathered dust, no longer called upon, while the rocking chair kept its slow, familiar rhythm by the fire. Each morning, Clara wove her braid with calm hands. It no longer bound her tightly in fear. Instead, it lay loose, gentle, a simple adornment rather than a shield. Elias worked the ranch with quiet diligence, and Clara walked beside him, carrying water, feeding horses, mending broken fences. Their silences no longer carried sorrow but settled into comfort, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Clara folded her shawl and placed it across the chair. For months she had worn it like armor, but tonight she set it aside. Elias noticed. He did not remark on it. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one before her. In that quiet offering lay the truth. She was no longer guest nor burden, but woven into the life of the home itself. Snow tapped softly against the window as Clara stared into the flames. At last her voice broke the hush. "I am not afraid anymore." Elias looked at her, the weight of years easing from his shoulders. He only nodded, and together they sat in the glow, the storm howling beyond. 2 souls, scarred yet steady, bound not by rescue, but by the freedom of choosing to remain.